discovered how trailblazing risk leaders navigate uncertainty with finesse and confidence? Uncover the surprising connections between their personal journey and professional prowess, and get ready to learn and elevate your risk management game with the Risk Masters podcast. Join host Julian Hay in collaboration with Risk.net as they delve into hidden gems of risk leadership through engaging conversations and thought-provoking insights from board directors to chief risk officers and business leaders.
Bonjour, welcome to the second episode of Risk Masters with Britta Achmann. In this episode, we're exploring the world of risk management with a leading market risk expert. Do you remember the 2008 financial crisis? Britta found her purpose in making sure history doesn't repeat itself. She's the co-head of market risk at Bank of America's Paris office, but her career journey wasn't exactly a straight line. Today we will explore 1. Britta's unconventional career path, 2. Her insights into risk management in both big players like Bank of America and smaller institutions like flow traders. 3. The game-changing impact of market digitalization, automation, and the rise of AI and machine learning. You will find more information on my website julienhay.com, including the transcript and the notes of today's episode, as well as tons of thought leadership articles on risk management. Now, more about Britta. Britta has had a dynamic career in finance, commencing at JP Morgan in New York in structuring and trading diverse derivative products. Following her move to London, Britta spent a decade at RBS and Deutsche Bank spearheading regulatory initiatives in response to the 2008 crisis. Before joining Bank of America as co-head of market risk, Britta served as chief risk officer at Flow Traders, a trading platform. Her role spanned risk, compliance, operations, and legal. In her personal life, Britta is a proud mom of twin girls, and in her spare time, she delves into personal development and leadership literature and is a devoted hot yoga practitioner. And now, here is Britta. Britta, welcome.
Thank you.
It's my pleasure today to welcome Britta Achmann into our second episode of Risk Masters. Britta has an amazing career in finance, starting in the front office as a trader and structuring, and then spending pretty much most of your career in risk management, in counterparty credit risk or market risk. You're currently working at Bank of America that you joined, I think, in December 2022, so it's fairly recent, and we'll come back to that. And before that, you were Chief Risk Officer at Flow Traders based out in Amsterdam.
Correct.
We could say more, but we keep to that for the time being. As we go into today's topic, I think we're going to cover 3 main areas with you. One is around your career path and how you got to where you are today. And I think it's fair to say you did not have a linear career, so we're probably going to come back to that. Then we're going to discuss a little bit your current role and contrast it as well with what you used to do, especially at Flow Trader, because you had 2 distinct perspectives on market dynamics and market risk in general. And then dive a little bit more into market digitalization, automation, and AI as well. So with that, I'd like to start perhaps. Do you have any fun fact you would like to share with our audience about yourself?
So I always find this a little bit challenging because as a risk manager, I think what I consider fun may not exactly be what the wider audience may consider fun. But I think a little known fact about me is that actually in my private time, I enjoy sewing and making garments from scratch. You know, the entire process from selecting materials, all the accessories, and then creating a pattern and putting it all together for an end product.
So we need to have some photos of you and final product, by the way.
Sounds good.
And so with that, I'd like to go into our first question for today. And as I mentioned before, I think your career was not exactly linear. So how did you get to where you are today?
It's a very good question. The whole thing is really was not planned. I started as an actuarial consultant. And I realized that was going to be like a long and arduous path for me. And I'm a fun-seeking individual, so that didn't work for me. And I was in the US, so I did what everybody does there. I reinvented myself by getting an MBA. And from an MBA, it's a great platform to get jobs. The US universities are really geared to helping you land a good employment. So I ended up in investment banking. Exactly where I wanted to be. I was at JP Morgan in New York in derivative structuring and trading, And it felt like one of the most creative places I could imagine. And it was a time of new products being created, synthetic CDOs being created, new markets opening up for that. But yes, that only lasted until the last financial crisis for me. And then, like very many people that worked in structured products, I ended up getting hired into risk management because actually the firms needed people with this product expertise and risk expertise within the risk management function. And you know what? In the end, I feel like I found my calling there. I really enjoyed it. I'm by personality type, which I now know thanks to my 18-year-old daughter. I'm a defender. And coming into market risk in particular and thinking back on the financial crisis where governments had to bail out large financial institutions, and it was really a transfer of risk that I thought was, unwarranted. So the shareholders that are usually reaping the benefits are suddenly, in some ways, not seeing the downside of the risk they were taking. And I thought this was one of the most uncapitalist events sort of in my life. And I felt, okay, my purpose is to ensure that there is no repeat of that situation. And yes, it's a very high-level purpose, but it worked for me. And I've been in risk management now since 2010 and enjoying it.
And when we see your career, clearly you've been sticking to that mantra as well, and we're going to come back to that. Just on a lighter touch, and actually skipping to a completely different topic, you have a very busy life. You just mentioned your twin daughters, and you're on your own as well. So how do you juggle such a busy life? And actually, what is your morning routine? How did you make all of this work together?
Don't laugh. While at RBS, where we actually work together, right, I was at one of these leadership programs, and they gave me a coach afterwards to work with, and she helped me realize that as a mom of, and a professional, pretty much most of your choice is using the mornings effectively. So for many, many years, I tried to really get up early and get my workouts in the morning. So when I'm in London, basically my morning is either I get up around 5 o'clock and head to a hot yoga class, or I get up around the same time and go for a networking event like a 7:30 a.m. breakfast. So that's my morning.
Which is what you've done this morning, if I'm not mistaken.
That is correct.
And I'm with you. I did my gym at 6 o'clock this morning, so I completely understand that before the little one wakes up. And I think, again, with your career being not exactly linear, what are the most challenging situations you faced, and how did you bounce back from failure?
That is one of the most challenging questions. So I want to say you bounce back from failure with planning. And maybe for me, the biggest failure in my life, and I'm sorry, I don't want to say this, it sounds like terrible now, but is my divorce in some ways. And it was a huge pivotal point for me from being in a couple of two, good salaries to suddenly being a single mom and basically the provider for the family. That changed my perspective on many things. So suddenly it wasn't just about ambition that made me want to progress in my career, but I needed money. And that drove me to do some career planning, really. And that helped tremendously. Before, I was basically going where life was coming, when a role seemed exciting. But suddenly I had this focus, like I didn't just care about an exciting role. It needed to be an exciting role that pays well, because I had this sole responsibility for my two daughters. I just had that chat this morning. I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing, but I now definitely look at my career differently.
And we're going to come back to that, I think. Clearly, having a family impacts everybody's lives, and changes priorities to that extent. And being on your own means that you have to provide, and there's no backup plan.
Correct.
And so, and I think we were talking about that just before, in fact. Which book shaped your career the most and helped you to be where you are today?
So I would like to mention two books. One was recommended to me during our time at RBS, actually, and it's called Managing with Power by Jeffrey Pfeffer. this book revolutionized how I think about operating at work. I never thought about power. Actually, I think it's one of the advantages of a lot of women that we operate probably with less ego and hence are quite collaborative. And because power seems like sometimes such a dirty word, I didn't think about, did I have power? Do I want to have power? Actually, I always thought I don't want to have power because I don't want to be abusing power. This book taught me that I actually had power in my role, and in my particular role at the time, I had information power, meaning I was a central point and people came to me to get that information. But I didn't realize that before. Once I realized how power works, I actually was able to say, at least I can assert myself, and at least I can, I'm not going to be overrun by others.
And the second book?
Well, the second book, which I have actually gifted more than 25 copies personally to people, is called The 100-Year Life by Linda Grattan. And I think it's a very interesting perspective on our longevity. It's a very interesting perspective also on our finances and the implications of this long life, from an educational perspective, from a career perspective, but also friendships. I've given this book to people who have changed their friendship circle after this because they realized their friends weren't serving them for like a long life. So I thought it was a very, for people nowadays, we're going to have a long life. We don't have the pension plans that our parents had. We need to do a complete reassessment of how it's going to be to live to 100.
Yeah, and, well, it's a good thing and a bad thing, I suppose. But there are plenty of books out there around longevity and
yes.
how we got there. I think the one I read is Ageless, which is fascinating in terms of how life actually expanded, but probably not for today. You briefly touched on gender and how your gender influenced your career. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that and the nuances you've noticed on how it impacted your career path?
So I want to say in the early stages in risk management, because let me take that part. I've noticed one thing, that when new topics arose, like things like stress testing, looking at capital, a lot of the, say, traditionally very technical male population didn't find these jobs very attractive. They were regulatory driven, maybe they weren't deemed as technical. They were basically the lemons. And I noticed that across various firms, like a lot of women ended up in those roles. But, we women are pretty good at taking lemons and making lemonade. And I would recommend also to women in the future, take these roles that don't seem to be maybe attractive at the beginning, but you can turn them into valuable roles. I've seen other women, turning governance, which again, a lot of people stay away from, into a very successful career path. Just because somebody else doesn't want to do it and looks down on it, doesn't mean it's unimportant. So I would say I've taken some of those roles over the years, and I've made those successful. One of the things is after me at RBS, stress testing was all male. It's like all the guys who've taken my jobs are it's really all guys who have taken my jobs. So, now it's a career path. I would say that is one of the things. And then as I got more senior, people knew what I can bring to the table. And I want to say that added a very nice element to it, that in some of the roles, like going to Deutsche Bank, they've designed the role around what I could bring to the table and add value for them. So I think this collaboration actually, where, they see like, okay, we want this person to come and we have a need and you're kind of creating a role for that. I like that a lot because I love these undefined roles that I can then shape. And for example, in that transition, I went from leaving a large team behind to starting with 4 people, and people were like, you're crazy. But I thought it was interesting. I thought it was going to be adding to my CV. It was going to be age-proofing my career, so to speak. I wanted that experience from project management. Yeah, again, I'm a risk taker when it comes to my career, but it has worked out for me.
And it's, in the way you describe it, it's also about vision and leadership. And I'm sure we're going to come back to that. Now, touching on, you're currently co-head of market risk at Bank of America based out in Paris. How would you describe what you do and where do you spend the most time on?
So now I'm back at a big bank. We are regulated. We have an internal model. So that means that I'm working a lot with the regulators on the internal model, on the whole governance. I would say that is probably a good chunk of my job because we have very competent risk managers sort of covering the desks. So my focus can be really on the more strategic items.
And here I'd like to jump back perhaps in your previous role and at some point contrasting with what you do today. You used to be Chief Risk Officer at Flow Trader, which is a trading platform. How did you ensure in that role that the board and the management team stayed on top of the risk agenda?
Well, in smaller firms, it's a little bit different. You don't have a lot of regulatory pressure. You have some, but not to the extent that we are used to it in the big banks. So there, I think you need to highlight more where the value comes from risk management, and that is general around, more closer aligned to the first line. So how do you protect the resources for the founders and the shareholders? But the good news is that firms that are listed, they do have requirements to fulfill. So people that coming from banks, we can say, okay, well, we do need risk committees. We probably need to talk more and with the supervisory board about risk. So for example, one of the things I did was like, well, you're talking 4 times to the auditors, but you're only talking twice to me, supervisory board. Like, well, we need 4 risk committees a year, because risk is what we're doing is a risky business. The whole business is, about taking risk. How can we only talk about risk twice a year? So we increased that immediately. They were very, they saw the point, and we did that. And the board was always very interested also in what do we see as the top risks for the firm. That being said, however, having come from large banks, I was much more used to having more regulatory pressure on governance, on risk measurement, etc., than on the buy side.
Personally, I find that an interesting contrasting point across comparing big and smaller organizations. But I also find it's actually bringing the value of risk management much further forward, because it's less about regulatory ticking in that context. It's more about the value actually proper risk management brings to the table as well.
Firms of all sizes sometimes forget what risk management is really about. And then to me, that's the core of what we want to do in risk management, is basically protect the resources of the firm. All the resources, from the reputation to the capital, balance sheet, losses, you name it. And so any firm should be interested in having risk management done just for their own sake. And you know what? The best firms do. So, not that I've worked with them, but from what I read about, like Citadel seems to be one of them, where basically there is a strong culture instilled from the owner-founder, so with a vested interest in risk management, to make sure it's done. Because the box that we operate in, that the regulator gives us, is a bigger box than the one we should set for ourselves. For ourselves, we should be stricter than what the regulator demands. Yet, often, it is the regulators who are driving change. And I find that actually quite a sad state of affairs.
Well, I always found regulators tend to step in when we fail to do what we're supposed to do. So it's a lot of the time the roots of and the origin of regulations. And I think that's a very neat segue to the next question around what would make the biggest strategic difference for the firm you work for if they were to shift a little bit the way they operate at operational and strategic level?
I'm going to answer that slightly differently. I don't want to just look at my firm, but I think one of the big regrets I've had in the last almost 15 years in risk management is that we do not invest in risk management research on how would we do things if we started sort of from first principles again. I think there has been a lot of work on risk management done, around the market risk, late 1980s, 1990s, 2000s. And now everything is about what the regulator demands. Instead of us sitting down, what do we want? And I understand there's a pressure on cost, there's a pressure on resources, and we don't have the spare capacity. But if my wish would be that we do create that capacity and really look at how can we use things like AI for risk management. And I know there's also regulatory aspects that are difficult, but risk management, market risk management in particular, is a very quantitative subject. There should be the ability to use new technologies much more to effectively risk manage, so that actually people could focus much more on decision making. Yet, all the investments we have to make, or we are making in all the firms I've been at, are basically driven around the regulatory initiatives, because it is so hard to get budget and resources.
Yeah, and I don't think there's going to be a choice for, I would say, organization more broadly to invest in those areas simply because those type of capabilities are being developed on the business side.
Exactly.
And so to drive business decision in the financial space, risk-taking decision as well. And so at some point, risk management will have to follow suit. And I think it's a very good segue into the next aspect I'd like to cover with you around the automation and digitalization of financial markets, especially high-frequency trading that we've seen that's been present for actually a very long time.
Yes.
And the rise of AI and how it impacts market risk. And in that space, what type of specific risk do you see coming to the fore as those new technologies are being developed?
Well, definitely operational risk comes to mind. As these algos operate, I think it's no longer just about the market risk. It's actually interesting because I think market risk finds it difficult to say, what is my role in algorithmic trading? In most firms, algorithmic trading is more supervised by the operational risk teams, which makes sense because clearly a lot of the risk is that the algo goes wrong. You need to have kill switches. You need to have controls in place, to place the orders, etc. So I completely get that. And I think a lot of the risk in the algorithmic trading is in the development of the algorithms. So, for example, in my last firm, we had a lot of discussions around how do we make sure that risk management is involved in the development of the algorithm. Compliance is involved because, compliance needs to make sure that, they understand or that the algorithms are compliant with all the rules and regulations for market abuse, etc. And then, what's the role of, let's say, market risk and others in the creation of the algorithms? So it's quite an interesting subject. And I've seen it smaller firms, and not my last employer, but others, really have a different approach to trading, where whether or not that this week we want to call it high-frequency trading or just algorithmic trading or statistical, is that you almost have no traders anymore, and you almost have no risk managers anymore, because the technology that's being created is being created by teams that are building in the risk management into the algorithm, And so this is basically, you have these highly technical teams that are no longer segregated, that are combined, that are doing a lot of testing and, updating the codes. So it is actually a complete paradigm change. And I don't know if we'll get there with the large banks, because our trading is historically, we still have, in some ways like voice trading, clients calling, trades getting executed. Not everything is electronic. But if it ever gets to that point, we probably have to rethink it, because we won't have traders and risk managers anymore. We'll have these integrated quant teams.
And it's, again, a complete paradigm shift in terms of risk management and what risk management means and model risk in that context, and the understanding and testing of those models is already paramount, but is only going to increase based on what you're saying.
I completely agree, yeah.
And I think it connects to the next question around, with increasing reliance on AI and also algorithmic trading, how has the role of human intervention in all of that evolved, especially in risk management? And you briefly touched on that already, but can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Firstly, I don't think we're really using that much AI yet. And particularly in larger institutions, we kind of also need to wait until regulators weigh in. And I think AI is a very misused acronym for what people want to actually express. You know, a lot of times they use AI when they're actually just talking about analyzing large data sets. We're not actually talking about really autonomous learning or intelligence. So, but maybe the main point I want to take out of that is that with the availability of all the information we have at our disposal and the computing power increasing constantly, I see basically, you know, a need for very technical staff. And what I already alluded to is, like, I do think there will be a conversion of the people who are creating the algorithms. The segregation that we have in first line, second line right now may, under those circumstances, not fully hold. But on the other hand, you know, I don't want to alarm anyone. I don't think this is imminent. I think, you know, this is like years away, because we're going to be gradually converging to that.
It's also about decision making, right? I think that there is producing information on which decision can be made, which is partially what you just described, and there is who presses a button at the end to send a trade.
Yeah, I think the decision making will be built in as well, a lot of it. So what I want to say is probably is more important about the strategy and agreeing on what are the parameters we all agree on. You know, for example, like in this modern, more algorithmic world, you can program like what are the losses that you're allowing, you know, what are the sizes you're allowing. I mean, everything can be pre-programmed. So it's much more the intellectual challenges and the conceptually saying like what do we want this to achieve, you know, versus, you know, me talking to a trader and discussing a position and saying, oh, well, I think this, he thinks that. What is the risk for the firm? How much risk are we willing to take? I think the risk appetite is preset, which is fantastic. I mean, you know, it's like you go basically straight from risk appetite to implementation. It will eliminate a lot of jobs, though.
It will. As a former trader, I will also say that I vividly remember my time watching the future market. It was in 2001. Where sometimes you had the impression that the automation had taken over the world, and because those loss trigger points were all activated at once, it kept amplifying and increasing volatility in the market, while the fundamentals had not changed. And for me, that component from a trading standpoint will have to be still catered for. You can't have that full automation and binary decision making.
Yes, I mean, I don't think that the trading we have in banks will ever really completely go away, because we are not there to be market makers just in the sense like electronic market makers. We're not there for our own profit, but we're serving customers. And in that sense, you know, if that corporate that needs something, you know, is not set up to do this electronically because they're too small, you know, there will always be the need for someone to execute a trade that is not fully electronified. I hope, because actually that is the part that I kind of enjoy of the business, knowing that you're serving real customers and the real economy. And I think that is what personally has always motivated me, is that we keep the economy running.
And it's a good segue, and you also touched on that, but I'd like to perhaps deep dive a little bit more on market stability. With algorithmic trading, I wouldn't say developing, but actually being unable further because of access to data. And for background for our audience, I looked back, I think algorithmic trading started in the 60s or 70s already, so it's quite old. What has changed is the access to data and the treatment of data, which has been exponentially expanding over the past few years, which is why we have so much of this discussion. So thinking about market stability, do you see any additional risk arising from the use of algorithmic trading, effectively automated transaction that you have not covered already?
I'm not sure, because the participants in that market are very aware of how the market works. The exchanges that are basically the recipients of this trading, they have a lot of controls in place. They really monitor what everyone is doing. And yes, I'm sure one could think people are doing ominous things, but most of the firms participating in that market, they're in there for profit. They're in there to reduce arbitrage opportunities. Others have certain ideas around how to build a portfolio and make money from that very short term. So I want to say overall, so far, I would say I don't think there are really players at the moment, big players that have ominous intentions. But I also see that the exchanges are ramping up in terms of like what they're allowing, how they're monitoring us. So I think I'm.
So it's a balanced view, effectively. It seems like it.
Yeah, I think everybody's learned a lot. Although, if you look at the LME event last year, I mean, that is one where you sort of think like, okay, well, should they have interfered earlier or not? But is that really the fault of electronic trading? So that I wouldn't say isn't exactly like an example where electronic trading has gone wrong. This is an example where, a lot of other things probably, were influencing the impact on the exchange. But think about it, most of the time, a lot of the electronic trading is done in fairly small sizes, very fast. It's a very different way of trading than the one I was used to, where it was all about sort of larger sizes and maybe not as fast. Here it's all about placement with the exchange, placing your orders, being fast, being able to retract the orders, being able, modify things. So it's a very subtle world. It's a very technical world. Personally, I'm really not that interested in that world, because at heart, I'm much more interested in the market risk rather than, what is the latency? How quickly can we place the orders? Are our data centers co-located? So I think that part of that business, let's say, I'm really not that interested in. I'm much more interested in how's the market risk that we are running. If the Bank of England is doing X, how's that going to play out for us? If something else happens in the world, how's the risk? Do we have enough capital? Those are the risks that I'm personally much more interested in. How is our book behaving under certain market conditions? That's probably also why I went back into a market risk job, because whilst being CRO sounds like a great achievement or something, but it was a very broad role. I had to look at the operational risk. I had to look at all the, it's like the management of all the limits with the exchanges, the internal limit management. So operational risk was much more in focus. Market risk was much smaller compared to, much smaller and much less complex compared to where my personal interest is. So being back at a big bank with a much more complex risk profile, and being back at a bank where you have like a huge product palette is much more interesting for me, and particularly fixed income products, because that's sort of where I have a personal interest in.
Well, especially nowadays with interest rates moving all over the place, that makes that segment even more interesting, I suspect.
Well, exactly.
With this evolution and with financial market becoming more and more digitalized and automated, how do you see risk management function evolving in that context? So you talk about AI, for example, so adopting AI, predictive analytics, and really moving more into that digital space. But what else do you see for risk management function?
So my guess, or maybe my hope in some ways, is that maybe risk managers become more holistic risk managers. Because right now, particularly in larger institutions, we're quite segregated. We do market risk, somebody else does counterparty credit risk, somebody does credit risk, somebody does, operational risk, somebody else does compliance. And as I was trying to explain, when you try to work on an algorithm, you cannot, you can, but then you have like one person from each area sort of working on this. You cannot keep it so segregated. My hope would be that people become sort of business-aligned risk managers. And that means I understand their market risk. I understand their counterparty credit risk. I understand what credit risk this desk may or may not have. I understand the operational risk they're running. And I understand the compliance, or part of the compliance that's important for this trading that they're running. Because that will enable the team to basically be like a full-service provider. Doesn't mean that one person has to be like the expert sort of in everything. But I do think if you have teams that focus on, let's say, a linear rates desk, and they have some automation going on, they have some algorithms, that basically the people who are covering that desk, they understand this is the operational risk involved, this is that risk involved. And we're not just approaching the front office, one by one from each angle in our silos. I would hope that firms or CROs at larger institutions look at that and sort of chart a path toward that sort of vision.
And it's a big shift. To your point, and I had the same experience, most organizations I worked for very much siloed. Even enterprise risk management, which is a bit of a misnomer in that context. And that's something that I'm sure, regardless of how risk function approach it, they will have to evolve if they want to deliver more values. Especially if the more done in the operation activities, to the point you made earlier, are called to disappear, which to an extent is going to be the case. So that holistic approach is absolutely necessary. But we'll explore that perhaps another time. So with that, thank you very much, Britta, for the more technical aspect. Now we are going to move into a lighter part of the discussion before we close. If you had a superpower, what will it be?
Maybe be more serious.
That's a useful one, by the way. I should apply this one as well. And what is your favorite book?
Currently, my favorite book is 7 Rules of Power. Again, same guy, Jeffrey Pfeffer, Stanford University. It's a book, I haven't given 25 copies yet, but I've given about 10 to people, and mostly to women. Again, because I think women do not think about power so much. We tend to try to please people more, be collaborative. And I think often women keep saying, but this isn't fair. I'm like, well, life isn't fair, right? Organization fairness is one of these concepts, like a fairy tale concept. We would like to think life is fair, work is fair, everything is fair. But does it have to be? No, it probably doesn't have to be, and it really isn't. And you need to be prepared for the fact that not everybody of your colleagues is going to play fair.
And I think, unfortunately, it's a natural aspect to it as well, isn't it? What is your favorite inspirational quote?
So this is going back to sort of my grandmother. She loved Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. And the quote she always had from him was, "It's only with the heart that you can see rightly. What is essential is not visible to the eye, or is invisible to the eye." And I kind of like that. Meaning, to me, we all judge each other by how people look. It's so prevalent that people look at someone. And maybe because my kids are mixed race also, I don't want my kids to be judged by the color of their skin. Yet I know it's the first thing everybody sees.
And unfortunately, it applies to gender as well. So, if people want to learn more about you, where can they go?
Please don't Google me. I actually, my family Googles me once in a while. I find that, I don't know, I find that crazy. I've actually did Google myself because I needed to get permission for this podcast, right? And so I needed to aggregate some of my previous speaking experience. And I Googled myself, and there's way too much information on people out there. So I find that terrifying. I would say maybe so that you don't Google me, go to LinkedIn and look at me there.
Curated content. And perhaps one last question for the audience out there, especially for emerging risk leaders. Any advice for anyone who is an emerging risk leader, thing they should be doing and perhaps avoid doing?
I see a lot of people getting frustrated mid-career. So I want to say, hang in there, believe in yourself, be brave, maybe take a career risk. That can be sometimes, very, very useful to take a bit of a detour and then, see where that takes you. But I want to say, what I see is that the people that succeed in the end are the people that have grit and stick around. So, don't give up too soon on yourself and believe in yourself is really what I want to leave people with.
Thank you. Such a great advice. And I had to remind myself of that advice so many times as well.
Right?
In fact, I remember, I think it was an MBA teacher telling, the moment you're getting bored is probably the time where you should stick around. If for anything, because from a value standpoint, this is where you are the most valuable.
So true, but yet so hard to do. For an intelligent person, sticking around when you're getting a little bit bored is actually super hard.
Well, Britta, thank you very much for your time. It was a treat. I really enjoyed the discussion. And I hope to have you again on this show at some point, perhaps to dive a little bit more around market dynamics. And share your experience there. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure to meet you again and to talk to you about these AI-related topics.
It is always a privilege to exchange with remarkable leaders such as Britta, and there is so much to learn from her insights and experience. The development of new approach to trading in smaller firms, where everything gets coded including risk management, open the door to the digitalization and automation of risk monitoring and decision activities, shifting the attention of risk managers from execution oversight to strategy. As Britta mentioned, while AI adoption remains constrained by regulatory progress in larger institutions, there exists an opportunity for those firms to lead the charge in risk management research, moving beyond compliance-centric concerns. So again, some great insights from Britta today. To dive deeper into today's episode and access show notes, transcripts, and more, visit my website, julienhay.com. And remember, keep pushing boundaries, keep having an impact, and never shy away from becoming the master of your destiny. To the next time.
Thank you for joining us on Risk Masters today. If you're ready to master risk and unleash your full potential, here's how you can take the next steps. First, head over to julienhay.com to discover even more valuable insights from our Risk Masters. We've got a treasure trove of knowledge waiting for you. Second, don't miss out on future episodes. Hit that subscribe button on your favorite podcasting platform. Stay tuned for fascinating discussions on risk management. And third, if you found today's episode valuable, please share it on social media. Help others discover the world of Risk Masters and embark on their journey of risk mastery. Remember, success favors the bold. See you on the next episode of Risk Masters.